My name is Richard Hayes, and I'm just an ordinary guy from a small, rain-drenched town somewhere in the heart of America. It's the kind of place where the sky's always gray, the streets are lined with old brick buildings, and folks hold tight to tradition like it's the only thing keeping the world from falling apart. Church on Sundays, a firm handshake, and a good name, that's what matters here. I've lived in this town my whole life, worked the same factory job for 20 years, and built a family I thought was rock solid. My wife, Linda, she's the quiet type, always keeping the house warm with her soft voice and steady hands. And my son, Chris, 14 years old, he was my pride, my little man. I had big plans for him, grow up strong, play ball, maybe take over my spot on the factory line someday. I thought I had it all mapped out. But one rainy night, that map got torn to shreds, and I was the one holding the pieces. Hey, if you're already hooked on where this story's going, do us a favor, smash that like button, share this with a friend who loves a good tale, and hit subscribe to Heart Stories so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's dive in together. It was a Tuesday. I remember that much. The rain was coming down hard, beating on the roof like it had a grudge. We were sitting at the supper table, me, Linda, and Chris, in our little kitchen with the chipped yellow paint and the light buzzing overhead. The smell of Linda's mashed potatoes and gravy filled the air, the kind of comfort food that usually made everything feel right, even after a long shift. I was digging in, my mind still stuck on a busted conveyor belt at work, when Chris broke the silence. His voice came out small, trembling like a leaf caught in the wind. "Dad, Mom, I need to tell you something." He stopped, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. And I glanced up, half expecting him to ask for seconds. But then he took a deep breath and said it. "I'm gay." The world stopped. My fork hung there in midair, gravy dripping onto the tablecloth like blood from a wound. Gay? That word slammed into me, sharp and heavy, like a hammer cracking through every picture I'd painted of our future. It didn't fit, couldn't fit in the life I'd built. Linda didn't move, her eyes locked on her plate, her face draining of color like someone had flipped a switch. Her fingers tightened around her fork, but she didn't look up. The rain kept pounding outside, but inside, it was dead quiet, a silence so thick it choked me. Then the anger hit, rising up fast and fierce, like a wildfire I couldn't control. "Yain, you've ruined this family," I shouted, slamming my fist down so hard the table shook. The gravy bowl tipped, spilling across the wood, and Linda flinched. But I didn't care. "How dare you shame us like this? You think you can just sit there and say that? Like it's nothing?" And my voice roared over the storm. Bouncing off the walls of the house, I'd worked my hands raw to keep standing. Chris's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks. Those same cheeks I used to kiss goodnight when he was a toddler in his cowboy pajamas. Dad, please, sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking. "I didn't choose this. I just want to be honest about who I am." Honest? That word burned me worse than anything. Honest? You call this honest? It's a disgrace. It's filthy. No son of mine's gonna sit under my roof and spew something so wrong. Get out of my house right now." I was on my feet, shaking, my throat raw from yelling. But there was something else there, gnawing at the edges of my rage, something I wouldn't let myself feel. Chris turned to Linda, his eyes wide and desperate, begging for her to say something. Anything. She just stared at her hands, then whispered, "Chris, maybe you should go for a while. Your dad needs time." Time for what? To unhear it? To shove it back into some box where it couldn't touch me? "He's not coming back," I snapped, my voice like a whip. "He's not my son anymore." I watched him stand, his skinny frame trembling, his eyes blurry with tears, looking at me like I'd just torn his whole world apart. And I guess I had. I stormed to the hall closet, yanked out an old backpack, the one he used to carry on our fishing trips down by the creek, back when he'd grin at me with a worm on his hook, and threw it at his feet. It hit the floor with a thud that echoed in my ears, loud and final. "Take that and go," I said, forcing the words out cold and hard. "And don't you ever come back here." He fumbled with the straps, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold it, then staggered to the door. I stood there, fists clenched, as he pushed it open and stepped out into the rain. The door slammed shut behind him, and I heard his footsteps fade, swallowed by the storm. The house went still, colder than a winter night. Linda looked at me, her eyes dark and wet with something, hurt, anger, maybe guilt, but she didn't speak. She just stood, scraped her plate into the sink, and walked upstairs, leaving me alone with the mess. The rain kept hammering, relentless, and I sank back into my chair, staring at the spilled gravy like it was evidence of what I'd done. I told myself I was right, I had to be. I'd protected our name, kept us from being the laughingstock of this town. A man's got his pride, his rules. But if I was so right, why did my chest feel like it had been hollowed out? Why did my hands shake when I reached for my glass? Days turned into weeks, and I tried to keep moving forward like nothing had changed. I'd drag myself out of bed, pull on my steel-toe boots, and head to the factory. I'd spend my shifts fixing machines, grunting at the guys over the noise, pretending I didn't hear the whispers behind my back. I'd come home, eat whatever Linda cooked, meatloaf, casserole, didn't matter, and plant myself in front of the TV, flipping channels to drown out the quiet. But every time I walked past that dining table, I saw his chair empty, mocking me. I'd see him there in my head, laughing at some dumb story about school, asking me to check his math homework. Now it was just a ghost, a hole I couldn't fill. Linda changed too. She got quieter, if that was even possible. She'd move through the house like a shadow, her eyes red-rimmed some mornings, her hands clutching this old letter she kept tucked in her apron pocket. I caught her once, sitting at the kitchen counter, staring at it with tears dripping onto the paper. I didn't ask what it was. I didn't want to know. I was too scared she'd say something I couldn't handle, something that'd make me look at what I'd done. We barely talked anymore, just passed each other like strangers sharing a roof. The town wouldn't let it go. The gossip started slow, then spread like wildfire. I'd hear it everywhere. The gas station, the barbershop, even the hardware store where I'd pick up nails on Saturdays. T, heard your boys out there. Richard, I'm wanting him. Sure, they'd say, their voices low but sharp, sleeping in the park, running from kids who don't take kindly to, well, you know. So some would smirk. Others would shake their heads like I was some sad story they pitied. Heard he's a mess. Poor kid. Each word was a jab, a little twist of the knife. Cutting into the pride I'd fought so hard to hold on to. He made his bed. I'd grunt back, loud enough to shut them up, tough enough to convince myself it was true. But it wasn't working anymore. At night, when the house was dark and the rain drummed on the windows, I'd lie awake, wondering, was he cold out there? Hungry? Did he hate me? I'd roll over, pull the blanket tight, and try to bury those questions where they couldn't find me. One night, about a month later, I was alone in the living room. Linda had gone to bed early again, leaving me with a warm beer and a baseball game I couldn't focus on. The rain was coming down in sheets, rattling the gutters, and the TV flickered with static every few minutes. I kept seeing Chris's face, not the angry, tear-streaked one from that night, but the scared one, the one that looked at me like I was his whole world before I smashed it. I'd answered that look with a fist on the table and a shove out the door. What kind of father does that? Throws his kid out into the rain for telling the truth? I took a sip of beer, but it tasted bitter, like regret I couldn't swallow. I couldn't hide from it anymore. I was scared, not just of the town, though that was real enough. The looks, the whispers, the way they judged me if I let him stay. No, it was deeper than that. Uglier. Back in high school, there was this guy, Tommy Grayson. We were thick as thieves, best friends, I'd say, but it was more than that. And I knew it even then. Summer of '89, we'd sneak down to the river after dark, skipping stones, talking about nothing. One night, he looked at me too long. His hand brushed mine, and I felt something I couldn't name. It terrified me. I pulled back, laughed it off, and by fall, I'd stopped talking to him. Married Linda right after graduation, built this life to prove I was the man I was supposed to be. Tommy moved away, and I heard he drank himself into an early grave. I never let myself think about why, but when Chris said he was gay, it was like that river came rushing back, and I couldn't face it. So I pushed him out instead, made him carry the weight I wouldn't. A few weeks later, I was flipping through channels, trying to kill another restless night, when I saw him on the local news. Chris, sir. My Chris was, sir, standing in the middle of a town hall meeting, facing a room full of stony faces. He was nervous at first, his voice shook, his hands twitched, but then he straightened up, and his words cut through the air like a blade. I didn't choose who I am, he said, but you all have a choice. You can choose kindness over hate, understanding over fear. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding so hard I thought it had bust out of my chest. That was my boy, skinny, scared Chris, standing taller than I ever had, fighting for something I'd run from my whole life. The reporter said he'd been staying with Eleanor, the old widow who runs the bakery downtown, and I felt my stomach drop. He'd found a place to land when I kicked him out of his own home. I shut off the TV and sat there in the dark, the rain tapping like it was counting every wrong move I'd made. He was braver than me, braver than I'd ever been. I'd spent my life hiding, building walls, pretending I was tough. But Chris, he was out there, facing the world with nothing but the truth. While I sat here, a coward in my own house, I thought about Tommy again, how I'd left him hanging, how I'd let him fade away because I was too afraid to feel anything real. Now I'd done the same to my son, and the weight of it crushed me. The next day, I couldn't shake it. I drove by Eleanor's bakery after work, parked across the street, and just watched. The place was small, with a faded sign and a warm glow spilling out the windows. Through the glass, I saw Chris wiping down tables, stacking chairs, moving like he belonged there. His shoulders were straighter, his face softer, like he'd found something I'd never given him. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, and thought about going in. I could walk through that door, say I was sorry, ask him to come home. But what would he say? What could I say? Hey, kid, I was wrong. After I'd thrown him out like garbage, my throat burned, my eyes stung, and I drove off before he could spot me, the rain streaking my windshield like tears I wouldn't let fall. That night, Linda broke down. I came home late, my boots heavy with mud, and found her at the kitchen table, an old letter crumpled in her hands. Her face was wet, her shoulders shaking. I messed up. Richard, she said, her voice splintering like dry wood. My brother Michael, he was gay too. Our folks kicked him out when I was 16, and I didn't say a damn thing. He wrote me this before he died, begging me to stand up for him, and I ignored it. Now I've lost Chris the same way. I can't do this anymore. Sharai, she slid the letter across the table, and I picked it up. Michael's handwriting was shaky, faded, but the words hit hard. I don't blame you, Linda. But silence hurts worse than anything. I hope you find the guts to fight for what's right someday. I looked at her, my tough, quiet Linda, falling apart in front of me, and I didn't have a word to give her. She was right, we'd both failed, and the cost was staring us in the face. The next morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up before the sun, pulled on my jacket, and drove back to the bakery. My hands shook as I parked, my boots crunching on the gravel lot. I stood outside for a minute, watching the steam fog up the windows, my breath puffing in the cold air. Then I pushed the door open, the bell jingling like a warning. Chris was there, sweeping the floor, and when he saw me, his broom stopped mid-stroke. His face went hard, his eyes narrowing, like he was bracing for a fight. I shoved my hands in my pockets, feeling like a trespasser in his world. Can we talk? I asked, my voice rougher than the gravel outside. He nodded, slow and stiff, and we stepped out onto the sidewalk. I didn't know where to start, so I just let it spill. I screwed up. Chris. Hatam, I said, staring at the cracks in the concrete. I pushed you out because I was scared. Scared of what people would say, scared of myself. Stuff I've kept locked away for years. Stuff I wouldn't look at. But seeing you up there, taking on this town, you're stronger than I ever was. Kid, his eyes glistened, but his voice cut through me like a knife. You threw me out. Dad, you told me I wasn't your son. Do you have any idea what that did to me? I nodded, my own eyes burning, my throat so tight I could barely speak. I know I can't undo it. I said, and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to make it right, if you'll let me. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking at me, really looking, like he was searching for something I didn't know if I had. The rain started up again, a soft drizzle pattering on the awning above us. And I thought he'd walk away, leave me standing there like I deserved. But then he said, "Das ist pretty titty de warrant." Quiet and steady. "Maybe we can start with a talk." It wasn't a hug, wasn't a promise, but it was a crack in the wall I'd built between us. I'd lost too much to fear, my son, my family, my own damn soul. But maybe this was a way back, a chance to be the father I should have been. This story, it's not just Chris's, it's mine too. A man who let pride and panic call the shots, who broke his own kid because he couldn't face the mirror. It's about fear so deep it blinds you, about the wreckage it leaves, and the slow, hard climb out of the hole you dug. But it's also about hope, messy, bruised, real hope, that even when you've fallen that far, you can still get up. Just get up. If this hits you where it hurts, smash that like button, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Hard Stories for more raw, honest tales like this. Drop us a line in the comments. What would you do if fear made you push away the one person who needed you most? Stay with us to see where Chris and me we end up next.